You do not belong here." The words landed clean, sharp, and loud enough to cut through the soft hum of slot machines and the distant clinking of high-stakes chips, and for a moment, the entire entrance of the elite casino seemed to pause. Not completely, not obviously, but just enough for attention to shift, for glances to rise, for judgment to settle before anyone said another word. And Marcus Ellington stood there, just beyond the velvet rope, his posture relaxed, his expression calm, his eyes steady in a way that did not match the situation unfolding in front of him. And across from him, Richard Hale did not move aside, did not soften, did not reconsider, his stance firm, his tone controlled, the authority in his voice shaped not by volume, but by certainty, and behind him, two security personnel remained still, positioned with quiet readiness, not aggressive, not confrontational, but present in a way that made the message clear without needing repetition, and the glow of the casino entrance reflected off polished marble floors, casting warm light across tailored suits and evening dresses as guests moved in and out, though now their movement slowed just slightly, curiosity pulling their attention toward the scene, and Marcus did not respond immediately. He did not argue, did not question, did not reach for explanation. Instead, he simply looked at Richard for a brief moment longer, not with defiance, not with frustration, but with a kind of stillness that felt out of place in a moment built on rejection. And that stillness did something subtle. It stretched the moment, made it linger just a fraction longer than it should have, and Richard noticed it, even if he did not acknowledge it. His jaw tightening slightly before he spoke again. "This is a private establishment," he said, his voice lower now, more deliberate, as if reinforcing a boundary that had already been drawn. "Access is restricted to approved guests only." And the phrasing carried weight, not because of what it said, but because of what it implied. And a few steps away, a couple paused mid-conversation, their eyes flicking between the two men, their expressions unreadable but attentive, and Marcus finally shifted, not backward, not forward, just enough to adjust his stance, his hands remaining at his sides, his shoulders relaxed, his composure unbroken, and for a second, it almost seemed like he might speak, like he might clarify, explain, correct the situation, but he did not. And that absence of reaction created a quiet tension that settled deeper than any argument could have, and Richard took a half step forward, not aggressive, but assertive, the kind of movement meant to close space without escalating the situation. "I am going to need you to step away from the entrance," he said. And this time, the words were final, not a suggestion, not a negotiation, and still, Marcus did not challenge him, did not raise his voice, did not resist. Instead, he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if acknowledging something far beyond the moment itself. And then he turned, not hurried, not hesitant, simply deliberate, and began walking away from the entrance, the sound of his shoes against the polished floor steady, unbroken, and as he passed through the edge of the light spilling from the casino doors, his expression remained unchanged, calm, controlled, and entirely unreadable, while behind him, the entrance returned to motion, guests stepping forward again, conversations resuming, though now carrying a faint undercurrent of something unspoken, something that had not fully resolved. And outside, beneath the cooler glow of the city lights, Marcus reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and paused for just a moment before dialing, his gaze lifting briefly toward the illuminated sign above the casino entrance, not with admiration, not with frustration, but with a quiet recognition. And when the line connected, his voice was low, steady, and precise. "Proceed with the acquisition," he said, and then he ended the call, slipping the phone back into his pocket without hesitation, as if the outcome had never been in question at all. Inside the casino, the rhythm never stopped, not for a moment, not even for something that had just happened at the entrance, because places like this were designed to absorb disruption and turn it into silence. And under the glow of polished chandeliers and soft golden lighting, the gaming floor stretched wide, filled with tables, chips, quiet deals, and carefully measured conversations that never rose above a certain level. And Richard Hale stood just inside the entrance now, his posture still firm, his expression composed, as if nothing significant had occurred, and to anyone watching from a distance, it would have appeared exactly that way. Just another routine decision handled with authority, another unknown guest turned away, another moment that did not belong in a place built on exclusivity, and yet, something about the interaction lingered, not visibly, not loudly, but subtly, like a detail that did not fully align with the rest of the scene. And a few feet away, one of the floor's supervisors glanced toward the entrance, then back to his station, his expression thoughtful for a brief second before returning to neutral. And nearby, a pair of guests who had paused earlier resumed their conversation, but their tone had shifted slightly, quieter now, as if acknowledging something without directly addressing it. And Richard adjusted his cuff slowly, deliberately, a small gesture that reflected control, precision, and the confidence of someone accustomed to making decisions without consequence. And for a moment, his attention drifted back toward the doors, not because he expected anything, but because the stillness of the man he had just turned away had left an impression that did not fully resolve in his mind. And then he dismissed it, just as quickly, turning his focus back to the flow of the casino, to the staff, to the operations that required constant oversight. Because in his world, structure mattered, hierarchy mattered, and anything outside of that structure simply did not belong. And across the floor, a dealer placed cards with practiced efficiency. A group of high-stakes players leaned in slightly, their attention fixed on the game, their movements controlled, their expressions unreadable, and the entire environment operated with a kind of seamless precision that reinforced the illusion of stability. And yet beneath that surface, something had already begun to shift, quietly, almost invisibly. And it started not on the floor, not among the guests, but within the system itself, deep inside the network that supported every transaction, every authorization, every layer of control that kept the casino functioning without interruption. And in a restricted office behind the main floor, a screen flickered for just a fraction of a second, a subtle change in status that would have gone unnoticed if not for the quiet alert that followed. And a compliance officer seated at a desk glanced down at the notification, his brow tightening slightly as he read through the update, not because it was alarming, but because it was unexpected. And he navigated through the system with measured focus, pulling up records, verifying entries, cross-referencing identifiers that aligned too precisely to be dismissed as error. And as he did, the silence in that room deepened, not with tension, but with recognition. Because the information in front of him did not suggest a problem. It suggested a change, and not just any change, but one tied directly to the operational authority of the entire establishment. And he leaned back slightly, his eyes still fixed on the screen, processing the implications with care, because in places like this, nothing changed without intention. And outside, on the casino floor, Richard continued moving through the space with the same measured confidence, unaware that the decision he had just made was already beginning to reshape the structure he believed he controlled. And beyond the doors, under the cool glow of the city lights, Marcus Ellington walked calmly along the edge of the property, his pace steady, his expression unchanged, as if the outcome had already been decided long before he ever reached the entrance. The change did not announce itself. It unfolded quietly, embedded deep within systems that most people inside the casino would never see. And in the restricted office behind the main floor, the compliance officer remained seated, his attention fixed on the screen as he navigated deeper into the records, each click revealing another layer of confirmation that aligned too precisely to ignore. And what had first appeared as a simple alert now carried a weight that extended far beyond a routine update. And he leaned slightly forward, his posture tightening as he accessed secure documentation tied to licensing authority, the kind of information that rarely changed and almost never without direct oversight from the highest level. And as the files loaded, the room remained silent except for the soft hum of equipment. And on the screen, the ownership structure began to display in full detail, legal identifiers, timestamps, authorization sequences, all appearing with a clarity that removed any possibility of error. And the officer exhaled slowly, not in shock, but in recognition, because what he was seeing was not a malfunction. It was a transfer, and not just any transfer, but one executed with precision, speed, and complete authority. And his eyes moved to the primary name listed under the updated license control, and for a brief moment, he paused, as if confirming what he already knew, and then he said it quietly to himself. Marcus Ellington, and the name settled into the room with a significance that did not require explanation. And beyond that office, the casino floor continued to operate with the same polished rhythm, chips sliding across tables, cards dealt with practiced hands, quiet conversations flowing between guests who remained unaware of the shift that had already taken place. And near the entrance, Richard Hale walked along the edge of the main floor, his attention focused on maintaining order, his expression composed, though beneath that composure, a faint trace of distraction lingered, the memory of the earlier interaction still unresolved. And as he passed by a staff member, their eyes met briefly, and in that moment, something subtle passed between them, not spoken, not defined, but present, and the staff member glanced toward the restricted office before quickly returning to their duties, and Richard slowed slightly, his instincts sharpening, because in a place built on control, small changes in behavior did not go unnoticed. And he turned his attention toward the office corridor, his gaze narrowing just enough to signal focus, and without rushing, without drawing attention, he adjusted his direction, moving toward the area with measured steps, his posture still confident, but his awareness now heightened. And inside the office, the compliance officer remained still for a moment longer before reaching for his internal communication device, his movements deliberate, his tone controlled as he prepared to escalate the information through the appropriate channels, because in this environment, protocol mattered, even when the situation moved beyond expectation. And as he initiated the process, the system continued to update in real time, reinforcing the same conclusion from every angle. And outside, under the glow of the casino lights, the illusion of control remained intact, but beneath it, the foundation had already shifted, and the decision made at the entrance had crossed a threshold that could not be reversed, not through authority, not through assumption, and not through denial. Richard Hale did not rush, but his steps carried a new kind of precision as he moved toward the restricted office. The quiet confidence he had held earlier now sharpened by something he could not yet define, and as he approached the corridor, the atmosphere subtly shifted, not enough for the guests to notice, but enough for the staff nearby to straighten slightly, their movements becoming more deliberate, more controlled, as if responding to a change that had not been announced. And inside the office, the compliance officer stood now, no longer seated, the tablet in his hand reflecting the same information that had already been verified across multiple systems. And when Richard entered, the officer did not greet him with routine formality. Instead, he turned the screen slightly, offering visibility without explanation. And for a moment, Richard simply looked at it, his expression steady, his posture unchanged, because in his experience, most issues resolve themselves once clarified. And as his eyes moved across the data, his focus narrowed, the details aligning too cleanly, too completely to be dismissed, and he spoke after a brief pause, his voice low, controlled. "This is incorrect," he said, not as a question, but as a statement built on the assumption that the system had failed, and the officer did not respond immediately, allowing the silence to hold just long enough for the weight of the information to settle before answering. "It has been verified through primary and secondary channels," he said, his tone neutral, precise, and that response did not challenge Richard directly, but it removed the space for dismissal, and Richard's jaw tightened slightly. The first visible sign that the situation had moved beyond routine, and he reached forward, taking the tablet himself, his eyes scanning again, slower this time, more deliberate, as if searching for inconsistency, for anything that could re-establish control over the narrative he had already defined. And instead, what he found was alignment, complete and structured, every layer reinforcing the same conclusion. And the name remained there, unchanged, unmistakable. And as he stood there, holding the device, the memory of the entrance returned with sharper clarity, the stillness, the lack of resistance, the absence of explanation, and it no longer read as uncertainty, it read as certainty, and that shift in perspective settled in quietly, without outward reaction, but it altered the way he processed everything in front of him. And outside the office, the casino floor continued with its polished rhythm, though now, subtle changes had begun to surface, a supervisor pausing longer than usual at a station, a dealer glancing briefly toward the corridor, small details that, on their own, meant nothing, but together formed a pattern that suggested awareness spreading, and Richard handed the tablet back slowly, his movements controlled, his expression composed. But the certainty he had carried earlier no longer fully intact. And he spoke again, this time more measured. "When did this update occur?" he asked, and the officer responded without hesitation. "Within the last few minutes," he said, and that timing closed the final gap. Aligning the system changed directly with the moment at the entrance, and for a brief second, the room felt still, not because of confusion, but because the implication had fully formed, and Richard turned slightly, his gaze moving toward the direction of the entrance, though the doors were no longer visible from where he stood, and in that movement, there was no urgency, no panic, only recognition, and outside, beyond the controlled environment of the casino, Marcus Ellington continued walking under the steady glow of the city lights, his pace unchanged, his expression calm, as if the shift unfolding behind him had already been accounted for long before he ever reached that door. Inside the restricted office, the silence that followed Richard Hale's last question did not feel empty. It felt compressed, as if the air itself had become denser with implication, and the compliance officer remained composed, his attention returning to the system logs where every timestamp, every authorization marker, every verification signature continued to confirm the same reality. And Richard stood still for a moment, not moving away, not escalating, but absorbing the structure of what he had just been shown, because in his experience, uncertainty always resolved into either correction or confirmation, and here, neither option offered comfort, only clarity, and he slowly placed the tablet back on the desk, his fingers releasing it with controlled precision, as if letting go of something that had weight beyond its physical form. And when he spoke again, his voice was quieter than before, measured, no longer assertive but analytical. "Who authorized this change?" he asked, and the officer glanced briefly at the screen before responding. "The authorization originates from the primary ownership transfer record," he said, and the phrasing itself removed ambiguity, because it was not an operational adjustment, it was structural. And Richard's gaze tightened slightly as he processed that distinction, his mind shifting from operational control to legal foundation, and for the first time, the absence of a simple explanation became more significant than any explanation could have been. And across the casino floor, the rhythm of activity continued, but it no longer felt entirely uniform, as small inconsistencies began to surface in execution. A delay in approving a high-limit transaction, a pause before granting access to a private room, a brief consultation between staff members who normally acted without hesitation, and though the guests remained largely unaware, the internal coordination of the environment had begun to adjust itself in real time, responding to information that had already altered its governing structure. And near the main floor, Richard exited the office, his steps steady, his expression controlled, but his focus now divided between what he had just confirmed and what it meant for the authority he had assumed remained intact. And as he moved through the corridor, staff members instinctively stepped aside, not because of instruction, but because of presence. Yet even that dynamic felt subtly different, as if the usual hierarchy had been placed under quiet review. And Richard paused briefly near the edge of the gaming floor, his eyes scanning the space with renewed attention, not searching for disruption, but for alignment, because he now understood that what was unfolding was not a momentary error, but a systemic redefinition. And outside, beyond the controlled environment of the casino, Marcus Ellington continued forward along the sidewalk under the city lights, his phone no longer in his hand, his pace unchanged, his expression calm. And in that contrast, the separation between perception and control became absolute, because one side of the system was still reacting, while the other had already completed its decision, and the consequences of that decision were only just beginning to fully propagate through the structure behind him. The shift that had been building beneath the surface of the casino no longer remained confined to systems, offices, or quiet confirmations. It had begun to influence behavior across the entire environment, subtle at first, then increasingly noticeable as the operational rhythm adjusted itself to a new source of authority. And inside the restricted corridors, staff members moved with heightened awareness, checking terminals more frequently, verifying permissions that previously required no second thought. And in the main floor control station, a supervisor paused longer than usual before approving a high-limit table request, his eyes scanning the system status as if expecting further changes to appear, and Richard Hale stood near the edge of the gaming floor, his posture still controlled, his expression composed. But his attention now fully engaged with the environment in a way that went beyond routine oversight, because what he was observing was no longer isolated to a single office or a single system alert. It was spreading through execution itself, and though no announcement had been made, the casino was already behaving differently, and across the floor, a private gaming room request remained pending for several seconds longer than standard protocol allowed, prompting a quiet consultation between two staff members who normally would not hesitate. And that small delay carried meaning because in an environment built on precision, hesitation was not neutral, it was indicative of uncertainty and authority. And near the main entrance, the same doors through which Marcus Ellington had been denied earlier now stood unchanged. But their significance had shifted entirely, because what had once been an act of exclusion was now a reference point for a decision that had already propagated beyond that moment. And inside the system architecture, authorization layers continued to reconcile ownership data with operational permissions, aligning records that confirmed a transfer of control that did not require physical presence to execute. And Richard, moving slowly along the perimeter of the gaming floor, began to recognize that distinction more clearly, because nothing in the visible environment had changed dramatically, yet everything functionally important was being reevaluated in real time. And as he passed by a group of guests engaged in conversation near a high-stakes table, their laughter continued, their attention focused on the game, unaware that behind their experience, the framework enabling it was being redefined at a structural level. And Richard stopped briefly, his gaze moving across the room not as a participant in its order, but as someone reassessing its foundation. And for the first time since the evening began, his certainty no longer rested on position or presence, but on verification that was still unfolding. And outside the building, beyond the glass and light and controlled sound, Marcus Ellington continued, walking through the city with an unchanged pace, his silhouette passing under intermittent street lighting, while behind him the system he had engaged with did not resist, did not react emotionally, but simply completed its update cycle, distributing authority across layers that would now respond differently to the same commands. And in that quiet separation between action and awareness, the full consequence of the earlier refusal was no longer approaching. It had already arrived. It was simply finishing its distribution through every connected point of control. By now, the change was no longer subtle. It had crossed from internal awareness into operational consequence. And inside the casino, the illusion of seamless control was beginning to show faint but undeniable fractures, not in dramatic ways, not in anything that would alarm the guests outright, but in the small, precise details that defined how the entire system functioned. And Richard Hale stood near the center of the floor, his posture still upright, his expression still composed, yet his awareness now extended beyond surface observation into something deeper, something that required constant reassessment with every passing second. And across the room, a senior floor manager approached him, their steps controlled, their expression carefully neutral, but their tone carried a quiet urgency that had not been present earlier. And when they spoke, they kept their voice low, just enough to remain private within the surrounding noise. "We are receiving authorization conflicts across multiple sections," they said, and Richard did not respond immediately, his gaze remaining fixed on the room ahead, as if processing the statement within the broader structure he now understood was shifting. And the manager continued, "High-level access permissions are being revalidated in real time, and some commands are no longer executing as expected." And the phrasing itself confirmed what Richard had already begun to recognize, that control was no longer centralized where he believed it to be. And for a moment, the noise of the casino seemed to dull slightly, not because it had actually changed, but because his attention had narrowed so completely that everything else faded into the background. And he turned slightly, his eyes scanning the environment again, but now not as a space he directed, rather as a system responding to new authority. And in that shift, the earlier moment at the entrance returned with absolute clarity, not as an isolated incident, but as the point where this entire sequence had begun. And the stillness of Marcus Ellington no longer read as passivity, it read as certainty. And that realization settled into Richard's awareness with a precision that did not require emotional reaction, only acknowledgement. And across the floor, another delay occurred, this time at a private table where a guest's request for access to a restricted area remained pending, prompting a second-level verification that should not have been necessary. And nearby, a staff member checked their terminal again, their posture tightening slightly as they confirmed the same pattern. And these moments, though small, were no longer isolated. They were connected, forming a consistent signal that the underlying authority structure had been altered at its core. And Richard inhaled slowly, maintaining his composure, because outwardly, nothing could be allowed to appear unstable. Not in a place built entirely on perception, and yet inwardly, the framework he had relied on had already been redefined. And outside the casino, beyond the reach of its controlled environment, Marcus Ellington continued forward without interruption, his pace unchanged, his expression calm. Because the process he had initiated did not require presence to complete, it only required execution, and that execution was now fully in motion, propagating through every layer of the system behind him. And inside, the realization had reached a point where it could no longer be questioned, only managed. And for the first time since the night began, Richard understood that the authority he had exercised at the door had not denied access to a guest. It had denied access to the very source of control that now governed everything around him. The moment of realization did not arrive with a loud announcement or a visible collapse. It settled into the room with a quiet certainty that could no longer be ignored. And Richard Hale stood at the center of a system that was still functioning, still moving, still presenting the illusion of control, yet no longer responding to him in the way it had only minutes before. And around him, the staff continued to perform their roles with professionalism, but their movements carried hesitation. Their decisions now filtered through verification processes that had not existed earlier. And across the casino floor, small inconsistencies began to align into a pattern that no longer required interpretation, a request delayed here, an approval rerouted there, a secondary authorization triggered where none had been needed. And each instance pointed toward the same conclusion, that authority had shifted away from the visible structure into something deeper, something already established and fully recognized by the system itself. And one of the senior supervisors approached Richard again, their expression composed, but their voice carrying a level of clarity that replaced earlier uncertainty. The licensing authority record has been updated across all departments, they said quietly, and this time, there was no hesitation in the statement, no need for confirmation, only acknowledgement of a completed transition. And Richard did not respond immediately, because the meaning was already clear. And as he looked across the room, the environment no longer appeared as something he controlled, but as something that was now responding to a different source. And the memory of the entrance returned again, not as a question, not as a doubt, but as a fixed point in the sequence, the exact moment where perception had diverged from reality. And in that recognition, the contrast became absolute, because the man he had denied had not needed to argue, had not needed to prove anything in that moment. The proof had existed independently, embedded within systems that operated beyond the reach of personal authority. And near the main floor terminal, a staff member stepped back slightly after receiving updated instructions on their screen, their posture shifting in subtle acknowledgement of the new structure. And others followed, small adjustments rippling outward as each position aligned with the updated hierarchy. And the guests, though still largely unaware of the full scope, began to sense a difference in the atmosphere, not confusion, not disruption, but a recalibration, as if the environment itself had quietly changed its center of gravity. And Richard remained still, his expression composed, because outwardly, nothing could be allowed to break, not here, not in a place built entirely on perception. Yet inwardly, the understanding had fully settled, and it did not require explanation, only acceptance. And outside, far removed from the controlled lighting and measured sound of the casino, Marcus Ellington continued forward through the city with the same calm pace. His presence no longer needed within the space he had already reshaped, because the authority he held did not depend on recognition. It operated through consequence. And inside the casino, that consequence had reached its final stage. No longer unfolding, no longer progressing, but complete, leaving behind a system that would now function under a reality that had existed all along, unseen until the moment it was forced into view. The casino had not changed in appearance, yet everything within it had already been redefined, and in the final moments of that evening, the shift that began as a quiet update in a restricted system had fully propagated through every operational layer, leaving behind an environment that still functioned, but no longer under the assumptions that had governed it before. And Richard Hale stood near the center of the floor, no longer moving with the same unquestioned authority he had carried earlier, because authority itself had become something external now, something he was required to verify rather than embody. And across the room, staff continued their duties, but their interactions were different, more deliberate, more cautious. As every instruction they received now carried an additional layer of validation tied to a source they did not control, and at the main entrance, the same space where Marcus Ellington had been refused entry earlier that evening, the doors opened and closed in steady rhythm as guests continued to arrive, unaware that the structure governing their access had already been rewritten, and inside the system architecture, the final confirmations had already completed, aligning ownership, licensing, and operational control into a single unified authority record, and there was no reversal process active, no pending override, no competing claim, because the system had already resolved the conflict in favor of the verified holder, and that resolution now defined every subsequent action within the casino. And Richard received the final notification through an internal channel, not as an alert of change, but as a confirmation of status, and when he read it, he did not react outwardly, because there was no operational ambiguity left to challenge, only recognition of outcome, and nearby, a supervisor quietly adjusted access permissions for a restricted gaming room, their movements slower than before, as if recalibrating their understanding of procedure in real time. And across the floor, the atmosphere remained polished, controlled, and uninterrupted, yet beneath that surface, every function now referenced a different center of authority than the one that had existed at the start of the night. And outside, under the steady city lights, Marcus Ellington continued walking without pause, his figure gradually blending into the distance. Not as someone who had departed from the system, but as someone who had already completed his interaction with it, leaving behind a structure that would continue operating under his ownership long after his presence was no longer required. And inside the casino, Richard remained still for a long moment, his gaze fixed across the floor, not searching for disruption, but acknowledging completion. Because what had begun as a denial at the entrance had ended not in confrontation, but in full systemic transfer, and in that final understanding, the distinction between guest and owner no longer existed in any practical sense, only in memory.